In the summer of 1853, nestled deep in the heavy, humid folds of Tennessee's tobacco country, Louisa moved through her days with quiet precision. Her fingers, nimble and sure, danced endlessly over fine cotton and wool, threading needles and stitching seams in the shadowed workroom behind the big house. The rhythm of her craft was steady. The scratch of needle through cloth underscored the stillness of the morning's heavy air. Every stitch was a silent prayer, every garment a hidden story. None in the household suspected that beneath this seamless exterior lay a tension sharper than any blade, a reckoning fashioned in the clandestine folds of fabric. Louisa's life was one sifted through hardship and endurance. Sold into slavery at an age when innocence should have still graced her gaze, she had endured years of unrecorded pain and quiet resistance, her spirit folded into the confines of cotton fields and brick kitchens. The plantation itself was a sprawling maze of structure and control. The grand red brick big house, where the family lived ensconced in luxury, the creaking wooden barns where tobacco leaves curled in drying racks, and the cramped slave quarters where whispers of freedom mingled with the rough scratch of wood and tattered cloth. The scent of lamp oil burned faintly overhead. Tension hung thick as the summer's heat soaked into the very timbers. But a deeper shadow was stitching itself through the estate. From the big house came troubling murmurs, whispers of sickness that refused explanation, spreading like a lingering smoke through the household. The master's wife fainted without cause. The youngest son burned with fever despite the doctor's treatments. No one spoke openly, but rumors curled like smoke. Something unseen, something sinister, poisoned the family from within. Was it disease? Or could it be something more deliberately woven into the fabric of their lives? The ledger of symptoms was incomplete, and the doctor's remedies foundered in the thick air, leaving fear to take root in silence. The household staff shifted uneasily, casting furtive glances toward Louisa, whose calm remained unbroken, even as suspicion began to thread its way through the big house. Accounts suggest that in the oppressive heat, some servants noticed a faint, bitter odor clinging to the ill family's clothes, a scent that was not of this world, an oily bitterness that drifted like the faintest trace of ash. Could the very garments they wore carry poison? The question clung like a shroud, binding fear and disbelief in equal measure. Louisa's hands, always steady, paused ever so briefly at the memory of one seam that had felt strangely sticky, the cloth heavy, as though soaked with a secret she dared not speak. Would you have noticed the tiny changes if you walked the shadowed halls? The subtle shifts in the way fingers trembled, the way eyes avoided direct glances. The first act of rebellion is often silent, hidden beneath the ordinary, embroidered with layers of endurance and fear. Louisa's gestures were guarded, her stillness a cloak, her breath steady but shallow beneath the ceiling's low, flickering light. She was the unseen seamstress of a slow-looming vengeance, her needle a tool, not only of craft, but of clandestine defiance against a system bent on breaking her. Tales from the quarters whispered of her skill with the needle, a skill honed in long hours of labor and stolen moments. Her fingers, gnarled yet deft, wove both necessity and subtle resistance into every seam. The threads became a language, one stitched with precision and intent. And as the family's illness deepened, the tight knots of fear and suspicion began to unravel the brittle threads holding the plantation's rigid order together. How long before suspicion would solidify into accusation? The first crack had appeared, faint but unyielding, and it threatened to consume all who dwelled within the walls of the big house. The humid Tennessee air pressed heavy against the skin, sweat mixing with the earthy scents of tobacco and wood smoke, enveloping Louisa's world in a closeness that was almost suffocating. Inside the big house, the air grew thick with whispered doubts and furtive glances. No outward violence disturbed the stillness, yet an invisible war had begun. The needle's quiet beginning was a pulse beneath the surface, a silence loud with consequence, a stitch pulled taut between survival and rebellion. And as the first traces of poison seeped from the fabric, so too did the slow, inevitable unraveling of centuries-old bonds. The needle, delicate as a spider's tread, held more than thread. It bore the weight of unspoken despair and the first breath of revolt. Each stitch told a story too dangerous to say aloud, and in its quiet thread lay a reckoning knitted in secrecy, waiting to be drawn tight and unspooled. Would the household ever guess the true source of their ruin? Suspicion, once sown, promised to blossom into a harvest of bitterness and fear, heralding a reckoning sewn as carefully as any garment in Louisa's steady hands. Whispers first stirred in the stifling air of the big house, a tension unseen yet unmistakable. The physician, a man bound by his period's limited knowledge and faith in remedies, paced the polished floors with furrowed brow. His tools, glass vials, powdered herbs, and the bleak hope woven into medicine bottles, could not explain the strange ailment creeping through the master's family. Fevers flared, then receded, only to climb back higher. No wound, no malady could be found, yet the sickness tightened like an unseen snare. Louisa remained a figure of calm amid the growing unrest, her hands steady, even as suspicion sharpened around her like a blade. The plantation's corners filled with murmurs, soft as the rustling of silk, yet heavy with accusation. Could it be the seamstress? They whispered, eyes darting to her, soft with fear or heat, but edged with suspicion. Accounts suggest that the scent of an unusual bitterness clung faintly to the clothing, an oily, pungent trace, unlike any dye or fabric treatment known at the time. The poisoned garments became a whispered theory, a shadow threading suspicion into the heavy fabric of the household. The doctor's inquiries were constrained by the limits of mid-19th century science. Poison detection was rudimentary. Subtle symptoms were often misread or unexplained. The ledger of symptoms left gaps. Records imply that the medicine prescribed, opium and calomel, offered no relief, but perhaps masked the true cause. Yet, the deathly pallor, the sudden faintness, the stiffening limbs hinted at something more sinister than disease alone. The household staff's nervous glances and half-spoken rumors grew louder, their shared fear punctuated by the creak of the wooden floors under heavy soles. How long before doubt became certainty? Would you have questioned the woman whose fingers crafted your garments, whose labor was silent but constant? Louisa's face betrayed no sign, her gaze lowered, breath measured beneath the oppressive warmth. The smooth motion of her needle was a lullaby, practiced and sure, the sound almost a refrain in the hum of plantation life. Yet beneath her composed exterior, a quiet resolve tightened like the seams she stitched, every thread a containment of unspoken grievances and dark intentions. She was calm, but in that calm lay the weight of fierce purpose. Rumors swirled through the quarters and halls, poisoned fabric, an act of rebellion woven with intent. The overseer's voice, clipped and sharp, sought to control the rising tide of fear, his footsteps heavy on the floor as he issued commands to root out the source. Some plantation workers began to avoid Louisa's presence, eyes flickering with a mix of fear and belief in the unfolding tale. Yet even as isolation tugged at her, Louisa remained silent, a still figure among whispers, her needle continuing its quiet work beneath the dim glow of oil lamps, as shadow and suspicion coiled ever tighter around the big house's walls. The thick summer air seemed to press down heavier with each passing day, as if the very atmosphere conspired with the spreading dread. The scent of damp cloth, sweat, and smoke lingered, mingling with the bitter tang of unknown poison. A grim question hung unspoken. Would the truth unravel before the household's fragile order, or would Louisa's silence outlast suspicion, threading a fatal pattern none could yet perceive? The weight of impending accusation loomed as the household teetered on the edge, the needle's sharp point poised to drive the story deeper into darkness. Louisa's story began long before the needle grazed cloth, that fateful summer, rooted deep in a youth marked by upheaval and silent agony. Sold at the tender age of 14, she was uprooted from a childhood shaped by whispered promises and stolen moments of play, thrust into a world defined by iron chains and relentless labor. The ledger of her early life leaves gaps, fragments of loss murmured in the slave quarters, the broken ties of family severed by sale. Her hands, once free to run through fields or cradle a sibling, learned quickly the weight of toil and endurance. The plantation where she found herself, was a world sewn tight with invisible threats. The big house loomed, red brick heavy, with the dust of countless summers, its foundation set in a soil that tasted of tobacco and sweat. Inside, the sharp scent of oil lamps and polished wood mingled with richer perfumes. Outside, the earth carried the bitter tang of sunburnt leaves and drying hay. Every dawn announced itself with the clang of the farm bell, setting the rhythm of tireless labor that shaped Louisa's days and nights. Her mornings began with the rasp of coarse fabric between her fingers, the careful threading of needle and thread that forged the delicate surface of garments meant for the master's family. Every thread a tether to a life she did not own. Yet beneath this surface, Louisa's defiance began to take root, quiet, patient, and unyielding. The pain that had once threatened to splinter her spirit was folded into each stitch, a silent vow to resist in the only way left to her. Accounts suggest that her life was a carefully constructed mask of submission, calm hands, lowered gaze, steady breath, but the texture of her thoughts was coarser, hardened by years spent navigating the brutal demands and merciless control of plantation life. Whispers in the quarters hinted at her skill, spoken with both reverence and caution, for talent in seamstress work was a rare coin that could afford a semblance of agency within the system's grip. Beyond the walls of the big house, the family's decline quickened, shadows lengthening over the estate like the gathering of a storm. The master's wife, once vibrant with the ease of privilege, now moved with a fragility that betrayed no clear cause. Fever gripped the youngest child as days folded into restless nights. Medicine brought no balm, the household held captive by a sickness as invisible as the tension creeping along the plantation's wooden beams. The ledger of symptoms, sparse and frustratingly incomplete, told only of a slow unraveling where no seam or stitch was at fault. And yet, suspicion curled sinuously through these hushed spaces, insinuating itself like a poison as dangerous as any chemical. Would you recognize the quiet shaping of rebellion hidden behind folded cloth and demure silence? Louisa's needle, so often a tool of creation, now wove a hidden pattern, a code etched in fabric, a language stitched with intention. Her body moved with the discipline of long practice, yet beneath each careful motion lay the ghost of a choice made in the darkest corners of her captivity. The weight of such decisions settled on her shoulders like the thick summer heat pressing against the old wood and stone, a burden invisible to the family above, but palpable to those who labored unseen in the shadows. Her quiet defiance was a stitch in the larger tapestry of resistance, born from pain and resilience. As evidence mounted, the fragile order of the plantation teetered on the edge of collapse. The threads of rumor wove tightly around Louisa, binding her in suspicion even as her outward composure remained unbroken. The household held its breath, caught between disbelief and dread, as the first tentative accusations began to surface. What one act of rebellion might unravel, no one yet dared predict. In this crucible of fear and whispered truths, Louisa's silent rebellion began to reveal itself in ever sharper relief, each stitch a quiet echo of the larger struggle unfolding beneath the surface of the big house's facade. In the dim, flickering light of the sewing room, an unspoken tension thickened the air, an invisible thread connecting sickness, suspicion, and silence. The plantation physician, a man of methodical habit and restrained worry, found himself grasping at shadows. His tools, simple glass vials, coarse herbs ground in mortar, and the rudimentary microscope offered no clear answers. Despite tests, no known poisons or toxins appeared in the family's food or water, leaving only questions and grim unease. Yet he noted something unsettling: oily residues staining the folds of garments, a faintly bitter odor lingering like smoke smothered under cloth. Louisa's quarters, when searched, revealed only the austere simplicity of a life stripped to bare essentials: a small wooden table, sewing needles stabbing fabric cleanly, scraps of dyed cloth folded with care. No trace of poison lay in plain sight. This stark cleanliness deepened the mystery and sharpened the dread. How could the garments harbor such death without a visible sign of tampering? Whispers circulated among the staff, like restless ghosts. Some spoke of magic, others of old poisons taught in secret. Accounts suggest a rising fear of witchcraft clung to Louisa's calm exterior, her steady hands thought capable of curses as much as stitches. Would the household grant guilt to silence and skill alike? The oily stains perplexed the physician, hinting at substances derived from local flora, perhaps bitter roots or toxins extracted with a skill beyond his knowledge. The science of his day could not detect or counteract such subtle threats. His arsenal was limited to opiates and emetics, administered in hope rather than certainty. The symptoms, nausea, convulsions, inflammation, were erratic, defying the patterns of known diseases. Those who wore or handled the garments fell ill, their bodies marked by unseen agents, while Louisa herself remained untouched. Her skin glowed clear in candlelight, her breath steady as the night air, as if protected by her own secret. Would you suspect the very fabric that cloaked you? The needle that weaves safety could conceal peril. Louisa remained enigmatic, her face an unreadable canvas beneath the oil lamp's flicker, her movements mechanical, unwavering, the scratch of needle on cloth, a constant refrain, masking the weight of accusation gathering like thunder. The social fabric of the plantation frayed, stretched thin by fear and suspicion. Gossip morphed into accusations, and the overseer's voice grew sharp with dread. Whispers suggested substances steeped in shadow, bitter roots from the surrounding woods, concoctions passed down in whispered lore. The household balance tilted toward chaos. The sewing room's silence was a fortress and a prison. No evidence lay in the scattered threads or the sharp, clean snips of fabric, yet fear clung as tightly as thread to seam, binding Louisa to an invisible scaffold of suspicion. The house had shifted into a place where dread replaced law, where unspoken verdicts carried the weight of final punishment. Eyes followed her steady hands, hearts whispered betrayal, but the seams held fast. Each stitch hid the tension between survival and revolt, a delicate yet deadly dance unfolding in shadow. The poisoned cloth was no longer merely garment, it was message and weapon, a silent indictment sewn with care. In the gathering dusk of certainty, Louisa stood unyielding. Her silence was a shield as much as a sentence. Accusations rose, sharp and relentless, but proof remained elusive, like the faint, bitter scent hidden beneath layers of fabric and fear. Despite searches, questions, and whispered threats, her hands continued their quiet work, steady as iron hands sewing fate with thread. And as the poisoned thread tightened around the family's life, so too did the plantation's air grow thick with unspoken dread, moving inexorably toward the moment when silence would break and confrontation boil over. Whispers curled through the shadows of the plantation, like smoke slipping through cracks, unseen yet pervasive, heavy with dread. The illness that first tore through the big house had begun to touch the edges of the enslaved community itself. Those who had handled the tainted clothes reported strange ailments, aching limbs, rashes that festered beneath their skin, breaths ragged and uneven. The rhythm of suffering echoed beyond the family and into the quarters, echoing in hushed voices and furtive glances. Yet amid the growing chorus of fear and suspicion, Louisa remained untouched, an eerie stillness at the center of the storm. The overseer's voice, usually sharp and commanding, now carried an undertone of desperation. His heavy boots thudded down hallways, thick with unsaid accusations, as he rounded the workers, demanding answers not just from Louisa, but from all who dared to listen. Rumors spiraled. Some whispered of poison sewn into fabric by the seamstress's skilled hands. Others spoke with darker tones, hinting at witchcraft, curses drawn from ancient woods. Accounts suggest fear morphed into paranoia, as neighbors watched neighbors, and silence grew brittle, like cracked leather beneath each watchful stare. Would you find yourself isolated, fingered by invisible suspicion, even as the true source of peril slipped through your grasp? Among the enslaved, the sickness carried a different weight, a grim reminder of their entwined fates. Those touched by the garments, shawls, shirts, even the finer linens, fell ill, their bodies betraying signs of toxic contact. The once steady murmur of the quarters grew frantic, a whispered horror that Louisa might wield a power no one dared name aloud. Yet their silent observation of her, her steady hands, calm breath, unflinching gaze only deepened the mystery. She moved with a quiet grace, ghost-like in her distance, stitching beneath the dripping oil lamps, untouched by the illness that tore at so many. The sewing room became a sanctum and an enigma, a place where calm met suspicion. The darkness thickened as the overseer's men began to enforce quiet surveillance. The weight of authority pressed heavily as they searched for signs, discarded roots, suspicious powders, any material that might explain the invisible thread of poison. Louisa's quarters bore the marks of minimalism and precision: neatly folded scraps, shining needles, a faint smell of bitter root known only to those versed in the land's secret herbs. No smoking gun, no visible mark betrayed her intention. Yet, it was this very absence of evidence that allowed fear to blossom unchecked, weaving paranoia like a noose tightening silently. Would you dare speak against the tide of suspicion when silence offered only fragile protection? Louisa's eyes met each accusation with stillness, neither denying nor confessing, the lines of her face carved by years of quiet endurance. The social order, once solid, fractured beneath the strain of unspoken fears and mounting illness. The overseer's demands grew urgent and fierce, his voice an echo of authority fraying at the edges as panic crept deeper. The plantation, a place built on control and command, began to unravel in this whispered storm. The poisoned garments bore a weight heavier than cloth, threading the household toward inevitable confrontation. Accusations surged like a swell, waves breaking against the walls of loyalty and law. Louisa's silhouette remained steady, a ghostly constant amid the growing tumult. The plantation's life was now stitched with dread. Each shadow cast a question mark, each silent glance a verdict unsettled. The air was thick with the metallic scent of fear and bitter roots, as if the poison had seeped not only into the fabric, but deep into the very soul of the big house. In these haunted halls, the quiet rebellion was no longer secret. It was a whispered roar pressing closer to a reckoning sewn tight with silent threats. In the dim-lit parlor of the big house, tension solidified into an unyielding presence. Louisa stood within this makeshift tribunal, an informal court where fear ruled unchecked and justice had long since fled. No judge wore robes or wielded gavels. Instead, the overseer's narrowed eyes and the physician's weary gaze served as grim arbiters. The few gathered were shadows themselves, faces etched with exhaustion, anxiety etched deep into the lines of their skin. Louisa, calm yet inscrutable, met each accusatory glance with silence. Her lips pressed firm, her hands motionless as stone. The room held its breath, weaving suspicion into a noose tight around her neck. The record leaves gaps here, yet accounts suggest the atmosphere was thick with dread, the weight of worsening illness pressing on every soul. The overseer's voice cracked as he demanded answers. His commands dipped in desperation, tinged with the edge of growing hysteria. His daughter, once vibrant, now lay frail and unresponsive, a casualty of this creeping decay. The physician, bound by the rudimentary science of the day, could offer neither cure nor certainty. He spoke in muted tones of poison suspected but unproven, of strange oily residues discovered on garments once entrusted to Louisa's care. Yet despite mounting suspicion, concrete proof remained elusive, like smoke slipping through fingers. Louisa's silence reverberated louder than any accusation. She gave no confession, denied no charge, her stillness a fortress, unbreachable by fear or force. Her gaze, steady, unreadable, skirted the edges of confrontation but never yielded. In her quiet defiance, there was a profound moral clash. The enslaved woman, wronged by cruelty and stripped of voice, faced a verdict pieced together from rumor and fear rather than fact. Would you stand still amid such a storm, your fate swayed by whispers and suspicion? The plantation's plantation justice was swift and merciless, but shadows never confirmed their own truths. The gathering of voices, overseer, physician, servants whispered in hallways, formed a dissonant chorus clamoring for resolution. Some demanded punishment harsher than law allowed. Fantasies of retribution whispered behind closed doors. The ledger of justice was rewritten by fear, No trials, no witnesses called, only suspicion sealed with silence. Louisa was led to a dank storage room beneath the house, a space smelling of mildew and forgotten cloth, its cold stone walls locking away warmth and hope alike. Here, her fate lingered uncertain, framed not by evidence, but by the fractured morality of an era built on oppression and control. The big house itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of its own unraveling. Wooden beams creaked, shadows stretched long and distorted through narrow corridors, and the scent of wood smoke mingled with despair. The family's decline continued, a slow rot spreading outwards from the poisoned thread sewn invisibly in cloth. Louisa's silent trial was more than judgment. It was a crucible, revealing the cost of rebellion within a system designed to erase all but obedience. Her quiet endurance echoed a profound truth: in the spaces where law abandoned justice, survival itself became the act of resistance. And as the oppressive night deepened, the question hung thick in the air: what price was paid for rebellion, stitched in silence? Beneath the heavy shadows of the big house, Louisa's final reckoning stitched itself into the fabric of a desperate summer. The poisoned thread she wove into the family's clothing, an act as deliberate as it was unseen, began to unravel the old order with quiet ferocity. The family's illness deepened, sickness blooming in bodies once untouched by hardship. Louisa's silent rebellion was more than personal vengeance. It was a calculated strike born from years of unvoiced torment and survival. The house itself seemed to lean into decay, its polished floors growing dull under the choking dust of suspicion and fear. The pungent bite of bitter herbs, extracts drawn from local flora known to those who dared to wield them, clung faintly to the fabric. Accounts suggest Louisa learned this knowledge from whispered traditions, passed down in shadowed corners as a language of resistance. The era's limited forensic methods rendered uncovering such poison almost impossible. Physicians, bound by rudimentary science, could only note oily residues and bitter scents, their diagnoses as incomplete as plantation ledgers. The fear of witchcraft found fertile ground in such ambiguity, layering dread with dread's dark twin, superstition. As murmurs swelled into accusations, the plantation held its breath. Louisa remained an enigma, untouched by illness, a specter in smoke-hazed rooms, her calm a stone in the swirling tempest. The overseer's voice sharpened with desperation, commanding searches without mercy. Yet the needle's invisible thread wove through this turmoil, cloaked in silence as potent as any blade. Would you confront such intangible peril, where the line between skill and sorcery blurred beneath the weight of fear? The peril was not only in the poisoned cloth, but in the unraveling social order, the thin veneer of control peeling away to reveal fissures of revolt and desperation. Each whispered fear, each furtive glance, tightened the noose of suspicion. As Louisa's fate crept toward inevitable judgment, the cost of rebellion, woven silently in threads soaked in bitter intent, loomed large. The poisoned garments were no mere fabric, they were woven accusations, the quiet voice of resistance echoing through a house, sinking into ruin. In the waning light of the summer day, the truth sewn into the garments of the big house crept irreversibly into the open. The poisoned thread, hidden within the deft handiwork of Louisa's needle, unraveled lives in silent, lethal waves. The family's decline was no longer whispered rumor, but grim and undeniable reality. The master's fever burned hotter. His wife's frailty deepened, children's small bodies weakened beneath invisible assault. Around them, the house itself seemed to surrender to decay. The once polished floorboards dull with dust, the air thickened by secrets too heavy to bear. The bitter smell of dried herbs lingered faintly, a tangible remnant of the poison's origin. Records imply Louisa's knowledge was handed down through clandestine channels, whispered from one enslaved woman to another, a secret legacy of survival and resistance. The weapon was not steel or fire, but subtle, plant toxins extracted and folded carefully into fabric, a silent force against a world designed to silence. The limited forensic skills of the day could detect neither the full scope nor nature of such poisons, leaving suspicion to fester into fear and superstition. Whispers of witchcraft clung like smoke, melding dread with myth in the minds of the fearful and the powerless alike. Louisa herself remained a figure carved from mystery, poised and untouched amid the mounting sickness. Her hands never trembled. Her breath stayed steady under the flickering flame of oil lamps. The overseer's voice cracked with rising hysteria as he ordered intensified searches, desperate to find tangible proof amid the invisible threat. The needle's invisible thread wound tighter still, sealing suspicion and sealing Louisa's fate. Would you dare confront such an unseen enemy, where skill and silence become weapons more deadly than any sword? As the plantation unraveled, so too did the social fabric, fraying in the grip of fear and unanswered questions. Every whispered suspicion, every hurried glance hardened the unspoken noose tightening around Louisa. Her silent rebellion was no longer secret. It was a gathering storm, a quiet battle reverberating across the creaking walls of the big house. The poisoned garments carried more than toxins. They bore the weight of a woman's pain, resilience, and fierce intent, weaving resistance into the very seams of a collapsing life. In the growing gloom of the plantation's decline, Louisa's poisoned thread wove a tale far larger than herself, a reckoning sewn through cloth and silence. The family's health faltered under the invisible assault, each breath a labor, each tremor a whispered revolt against the tyranny of their lives. The big house, once vibrant and commanding, now sagged beneath a shroud of quiet despair. The air held the faint sting of bitter herbs, a remnant of poison steeped not only in fabric but in centuries of coerced pain. The knowledge Louisa wielded of poisons distilled from local plants, of bitter roots turned deadly, was both ancient and fiercely guarded. Passed from one enslaved woman to another, in whispered confidence, it formed a secret language of resistance and survival. The era's primitive forensic tools and medical practices could do little more than note oily stains and bitter scents without naming their cause. Fear found fertile ground in ignorance, intertwining with superstition. Whispers of witchcraft became indistinguishable from truth, reflecting a desperate search for order amid chaos. Louisa herself remained apart, a figure untouched by sickness but deeply entwined in suspicion. Her hands, skilled and steady, moved with practiced grace under the weak lamplight, while the overseer's voice grew sharp with dread. Searches intensified, spaces ransacked in hopes of uncovering the invisible weapon. Yet the needle's quiet thread was elusive, stitching fate in silence, binding accusation without proof. Would you confront an enemy who moves unseen, whose harm is woven tightly into the very fabric surrounding you? The plantation, so dependent on order and control, creaked and groaned under the strain of unraveling trust. Suspicion blossomed into paranoia. Every glance, every whispered word tightened the noose of fear. Louisa's quiet rebellion was no mere act of desperation. It was a silent war, fought stitch by stitch, breath by breath. The poisoned garments were more than cloth. They were testament to a courage born in shadows, a legacy threaded deep within a house, now haunted by its own unraveling.